Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Today we're going to dive back into some Mitsi Studio. It's animated. If you're not familiar with them, it can be a little crude at times, so here's your family-friendly warning ahead of time. But this is a more recent topic of history, but one that folks of my generation remember very well because we've lived through it, and that is the story of the War on Terror. Well, that was the title that was used by George W. Bush and his administration to describe the military operations that happened in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. As an extension of that was the war in Iraq, but specifically when we're talking about the war on terror, we're talking mostly about what happened in Afghanistan. We're talking about the hunt for Al-Qaeda and ultimately Osama bin Laden, which was not concluded until the Obama administration a few years after Bush left office. So I'll put a link down in the description. I'm also going to pin down in the comment section my playlist to all of the Mitsi Studio reactions that I've done in the past, so you can check all of those out. If you like their videos and you want to see more, of course, check out their channel. I want to thank Camdella1 for your support on Patreon. Could not do this without you. Let's dive into this one.
This is Osama bin Laden, once crowned the world's most wanted terrorist. Under his leadership, Al-Qaeda pilots were trained to crash Boeing planes, long before Boeing planes crashed by themselves. Twin towers, large dust clouds, brave firefighters running toward chaos. Sound familiar? Yep, in the end, it took the US nearly 10 years to hunt this terrorist leader down, from the smoldering twisted steel of Ground Zero to a quiet suburb in Abbottabad, Pakistan.
So just some background for those who might not be real familiar with this story. This was not Osama bin Laden's entrance onto the world stage. He was already pretty well known. In fact, most of American intelligence knew instantly that he was probably responsible for this. There had been other terrorist attacks, pretty significant ones, in the years leading up to this. There had even been an attack, I don't know how much associated with him it was, but there had been a previous attack on the World Trade Center. There was a bomb that went off in the parking garage underneath the World Trade Center a few years earlier. And there have been a lot of arrests related to all of that. So, you know, this was a well-known network that was already being watched, and there had been opportunities to get him under Clinton's administration, but at the time it wasn't deemed the right sort of priority as far as the risk that was going to be taken in order to make that operation a success.
Sorry, where? A goat fuck do I know somewhere city in a somewhere province of somewhere Pakistan. Anyway, in this video we will dive into the attacks on 9/11, the decade-long manhunt for the mastermind behind this plot, and the raid on the guy's chill mansion in that goat love-making place which we just mentioned. Now, to understand how bin Laden was able to pull off an attack of this magnitude, we have to go back to the Soviet-Afghan War of 1979 to 1989.
And as always, everything's connected, so you could go back to the Soviet-Afghan War, so that means you could go back to what led up to that war, which led up to what began before that. You're always going to have to choose a starting point when telling these stories, and this is as good a spot as any.
So during those years, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan because the Soviet Union was a superpower, and superpowers tend to mess around in South Asia and the Middle East. No history book required there. Now, after the Soviet Union was done invading and stuff, they shift changed with the Americans, who were slowly prepping for another shit.
Habibi, want to see how this war unfolded? Habibi is an Arabic word that means beloved. It's very common over there. In fact, our group chat from our Egypt tour in December of last year is, I think it's called Egypt Habibis or something. It's great. It's a term of endearment, and it's fun to use over there. Afghanistan is just one more of those places like Korea, Vietnam, and other places where the Cold War was manifested in a particular way. So the Soviets invade Afghanistan, and of course that means Western powers like the United States are going to do everything they can to fund and arm the people who are fighting against the Soviet Union while not fighting directly. And this is something, of course, that I'm sure they're going to get to is going to backfire spectacularly on the United States.
Show known as the Gulf War. And during these years, a young fighter moved through the ranks and started to build a network of militants and financial backers. But these guys eventually formed Al-Qaeda, a militant group who would continue the fight for defending Muslims worldwide. And by defending, we mean blowing stuff up while screaming, "God is the goat." Now, over the years, this militant group prepared their master project, an attack on the US, by hijacking commercial airliners and flying them into buildings. Spoiler alert, they actually succeeded.
And one of the craziest things about this is, of course, that some of these guys trained here in the United States. They went to flight schools like Embry-Riddle in Florida. And this is where they learned to execute the operation that they ended up executing on September 11th.
Mostly. Since 4 hijackers on Flight 93 were getting their heads caved in by an angry mob of passengers before crashing their plane into a field. So, in the aftermath of the US...
Crazy thing for me personally that day is that basically Flight 93 was hijacked right over my head. Right here in northeastern Ohio, if you look at the maps of about where it happened pretty much right over top of us. And then they flew a little further before they turned around and started heading back. And, it all could have been so much worse, but it was all so awful as it was. We didn't know. I mean, despite being in the modern era, we had no idea how many people had actually died that day for quite some time afterwards. If you watch a video of David Letterman when he came back on the air a week after these events, you'll see him talk about how 5,000 people were dead. Now, we know that there weren't that many, but at the time, we thought there were that many, and a few days before that, we thought it was even more than that.
Attacks, President George W. Bush declared a war on terror, which the average American interpreted as "don't trust people with beards."
The unfortunate reality is, he says the average American, I wouldn't go that far. I know what he's saying, because there are always morons. There are always morons who just don't know how to think critically and don't know how to be reasonable. And the idea that because these 19 men who happened to be Arab, who happened to be Muslim, did what they did, does not translate to all Arabs and all Muslims are bad or evil. In fact, the vast majority are wonderful human beings. And every Arab, every Muslim that I've personally met has been a wonderful human being, has been better than the average American that I've met. But they give the rest of them a bad name. And when you have people who just don't think critically, they think that what happened applies to all. And yes, there were some awful things that were done in retaliation and response to these events.
In October 2001, President George W. Bush launched the US invasion of Afghanistan. The mission statement was simple, almost cute really. Destroy Al-Qaeda, remove the Taliban, stop terrorism forever.
And it was actually a pretty interesting strategy. The U.S. didn't just go in guns blazing with thousands of troops on the ground. It started with air power. It started with CIA assets on the ground, working with rebel organizations like the Northern Alliance that already existed within Afghanistan, and using them as the ground forces. It actually made a lot of sense. Didn't work out as necessarily easily as the U.S. would have liked.
Easy. Bombs dropped, the Taliban folded fast, and Kabul fell. From the outside, it looks like the US closed the net around bin Laden in speedrun fashion.
Actually, the US did close the net around bin Laden in speedrun fashion. In December, they had him bottled up in Tora Bora, and then that's when everything went wrong.
Except the net was full of holes. During the Battle of Tora Bora, the US relied heavily on Afghan militias for ground operations, which were...
And this is where your strength becomes a weakness. This is where you use the foreign to us, but locals, fighting on the ground. And it made sense because it didn't risk as many American lives, and it utilized people who were willing to fight for their own country. But it also greatly increases the risk that you're going to have a betrayal, or you're going to have somebody with conflicting loyalties, and that's what ended up happening.
Not exactly the right people for the job. And additionally, the US upheld confidence that air power was enough to do the job. And ironically, the same confidence was shown by Al-Qaeda 3 months earlier. Sadly, their confidence was a bit more legitimate. Meanwhile, bin Laden and his group of fighters moved through a web of tunnels GLA style, while crossing the border into Pakistan. After the massive intelligence failure at
So the U.S. had bin Laden surrounded in Tora Bora in these mountains, and they did everything they could to try and get him, but like I said, there were some betrayals by some of the locals on the ground that allowed him to slip out of there, and then we lose him for 10 years.
Bora Bora, years of silence followed. The CIA had little information to go on. No verified selfies from bin Laden with bearded emojis. No shared locations, just a bunch of audio and video rants sent from a cave shouting gula blah 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 blah, death to America, zero chill, maximum rage quit without actually quitting. Because phones and the internet were not used and bin Laden kept mobile using safe houses and tribal connections, the focus gradually moved away from the person to the network.
And it's a pretty remarkable story how they used the courier to end up tracking him down. It's almost absurd that this is the level of intelligence that we have. And it shows how good his plan was for not being caught, that it took another 10 years with the level of intelligence gathering that was going on. It still took time, but it also shows you how remarkable U.S. intelligence gathering is capable of being in the midst of all of this. So you can watch stories like Zero Dark 30, and it'll tell you kind of the summarized version of what happened.
This network involved financiers, planners, security operatives, and couriers. And some were followed, some were interrogated. So this is an example of a courier being followed. And this is an example of a courier being interrogated.
So they're dumping him in the water. There was a big thing, if you don't remember it, if you're not old enough to remember it, waterboarding was one of what they called the enhanced interrogation techniques. It's a fancy way of saying a form of torture. There was no actual physical harm, I don't believe, through waterboarding, but it scares the bejesus out of you, makes you feel like you're drowning, and so it's certainly psychological torture. And there's debate about how actually effective that technique even is, or sleep deprivation, humiliation, things like that. So there's a lot of debate about those kinds of things and the efficacy of those things. In the end, did it result in the capture or the killing of bin Laden? I'm not sure that it did. I think we used other means in order to be able to do that.
After this went on for some time, there was one particular courier who caught the CIA's attention. By mapping his routes, the courier led the intelligence analysts to a peculiar-looking building in a suburb in Abbottabad, Pakistan. This building had thick walls all around. However, there was no internet, no phone lines, and no letterbox with a sticker saying, "No advertisement mail, your boy Osama." So, despite not being sure the target was in the compound, there were enough leads for the Americans to start prepping SEAL Team 6 for a visit.
Yeah, so what they knew was there's definitely someone who does not want to be known who's in there. It's a high-value individual of some kind. But they couldn't confirm one way or another that it was bin Laden. They knew that it was somebody tall. Like, there was a lot of circumstantial evidence that it could be him, but nothing that said, yes, this is him. And so it was a big risk. And you have to give the Obama administration a lot of credit for being willing to take this risk, and not only to just drop a bomb on the thing and obliterate it, which they certainly could have done, but to actually send in a military operation that had a lot of inherent risks to it in order to be able to be sure.
And by prepping, I mean SEAL Team 6 style prepping. That means building a replica of the entire compound.
Yeah, that's what's amazing about this. They legitimately built a replica of the compound so they could practice based on what they knew of it.
And starting to play war games like it was frickin' CSGO server. After weeks of intensive training, President Barack Obama gave the go-ahead for Operation Neptune Spear.
Operation Neptune Spear. And if you watch, they had the White House Correspondents' Dinner on the very night that this operation was going down. And there was actually a joke about bin Laden made during that dinner.
Hopes bin Laden was, well, actually hurt. Two modified stealth Black Hawk helicopters picked up the Navy SEALs from a US base somewhere in Afghanistan. They flew covertly at night across Pakistan to reach Abbottabad. And upon arriving in pitch-black darkness, one of the helicopters immediately crashed inside the compound.
So there was an issue because of the way they were flying, and I don't fully understand how helicopters work, but I know it has to do with lift, and air temperature can change that, and different things like that. And because of where they came in and how they came in, it actually caused a problem with lift, and the helicopter crashed. Nobody was killed. It was pretty remarkable, honestly, and they had to leave the one helicopter behind. You've got right down the street, you've got basically what amounts to Pakistan's version of West Point. Their military academy is in the same town. So, this is such a dangerous, there's so many things that could have gone wrong here.
Al-Qaeda pilots are taking notes. Now, despite the crash, the SEAL teams moved quickly, blasting walls and doors as they worked their way to the upper floors. And while doing so, they shot and killed a few couriers and some bodyguards.
And I believe one of bin Laden's sons, I mean, he has like ridiculous amount of those, but I think one of them was killed too.
And this bodyguard is now teabagged for some dramatic purposes. Reaching the third floor, the SEAL team moved inside another room. In front of them stood a bodyguard raising his weapon. Shots were fired, and the defender fell dead to the floor. Through the smoke, a silhouette appeared in the back of the room. The SEALs aimed their weapons and recognized the individual. It was Osama bin Laden himself. Reports of what happened next vary. Not that it matters a lot, because, the SEALs were there to kill the guy. That's exactly what they did. Nearby, one of Osama's wives was shot in the leg, added kitchen and return key emoji.
And there were kids there as well, and they were able to secure the kids and get them out of the way. The whole thing in and of itself is a remarkable story about how this operation went down, what they were able to gather, and how quickly they did it. They took bin Laden's body with them. He was eventually buried at sea afterwards from an aircraft carrier.
While restraining more civilians, the men also collected hard drives, laptops, mobile phones, and the dead body of bin Laden for identification. When the SEALs exited the building, the damaged helicopter was blown up. Immediately after, the whole team boarded the remaining Black Hawk. A cloud of dust was kicked up.
There wasn't enough room on the remaining helicopter. They actually had to bring in another helicopter to help pick them up.
Rotor blades, and the helicopter disappeared into the dark night. After the Navy SEAL team arrived safely back at the US base in Afghanistan, the body of bin Laden was moved to the carrier USS Carl Vinson for a burial at sea. Meanwhile, the CIA plowed through the evidence taken from the compound. Besides tons of valuable information, analysts also found a few things they were not expecting at all. For example, cartoons of Tom and Jerry, an episode of Mr. Bean, a documentary about sex crimes in the Vatican, and the viral YouTube video, Charlie Bit My Finger.
You gotta figure probably, because he had kids there, some of those were probably for the kids.
Additionally, his laptop contained the shooter game Counter-Strike. He probably wasn't any good. Otherwise, he would have checked double doors and wall-banged a few of those counter-terrorists running up and down his stairs. What a noob. Anyway, we hope you enjoyed this video about the world's most wanted terrorist. We've got...
Okay, that was well done. Obviously, these videos are short, so we tried to fill in as much as we can in that. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Add to the conversation. Let's talk about it. Obviously, with more recent topics, there's always a lot more heated energy involved, so let's try to keep it civil whenever possible and all of that. I want to thank Todd Burley and Jeremy Evans for your support on Patreon. Thank you so much. See you next time.